I remember this picture. This was actually, this was the day after, this is the day after my wedding day. Kevin was one of the first people there and spent pretty much the entire day with me, and just, it was wonderful just having him there as a support and as my brother. Kevin and I both worked for a private ambulance company as partners working 24-hour shifts, and we got very close. He had this wonderfulness that just drew people to him. He was very open, outgoing, easy to get along with. It wasn't even like he really had to do anything. We just meshed, and it just was like he became my older brother. I mean, I looked up to the guy. It's a tough one to see because I miss him. Right off the bat, he knew this was going to be the one. This is the girl that he wanted to marry. I mean, it was just nice seeing him finally find somebody that made him happy. Their wedding was wonderful, and he just embraced her daughter, Megan, like it was his own daughter. And they were to that point with all the love that they had, they were able to have their own child together. And then it just became like one big happy family. Eventually, Lisa had introduced the idea to Kevin about them taking in foster children. And Kevin was all for it. They wanted to be able to bring these kids in to give them some place safe to be. Kevin said they were looking at fostering a new child, said her name was Sabrina, said she was older, teenage. I wish I would have seen the signs of problems earlier, and I could have addressed the signs earlier, but there's nothing I can actually do about it. It's all in the past.
This is a picture of my mom wedding dress shopping. It was exciting to go shopping with her and for me to be there with her to pick out her wedding dress. When my mom introduced me to Kevin when I was 5, seemed like a nice guy. I was happy that she met someone, so yeah. When Kevin and my mom first got married, it was the honeymoon phase for a while. Everything was good. She finally found someone she's gonna spend the rest of her life with. And I was a flower girl in the wedding. I was excited. I was very excited. My childhood was amazing. I was the happiest kid, spending it with my mom every day. She was my best friend. Kevin and my mom were affectionate. It was a picture-perfect family that got destroyed very quickly. This photo is of me and Sabrina hugging. We were always doing each other's hair, like sister stuff. We would hang out a lot, do stuff together. Sabrina told me that she was happy to finally have a loving family and a home to be in. I called Sabrina Bree. I was excited because it was like I would have an older sister that I never had. My mom made her feel very welcome. Everyone was happy. And now all the good stuff is gone. I can't stand looking at photos of her. I can't stand hearing her name, anything about her. Can't stand it. Sabrina and my mom started to have a lot of tension. One day there was an incident with an iPad. Bree had the iPad, and I wanted it. And my mom went up there to get it from her. And then Bree said that my mom hit her. My mom never laid hands on her. I was standing right there. She called the cops. Cops show up.
I would never put my hands on any child.
They asked if my mom hit her, and my mom said no. I said no. And then they left. But after they left, Kevin put his arm around her, which I thought was really weird. That wasn't just comforting your kid. It was at the point where Kevin would stick up for Bree no matter what, and not my mom. So it was always my mom's fault. And my mom felt like Kevin never had her back anymore. It would make my mom feel unsettled. Like, why are you taking her side when I'm your wife? There was one incident where my mom and I were gone for several hours. We came back. She was with Kevin alone in a sports bra. I thought it was very odd, and so did my mom. My mom thought it was odd because you shouldn't be in a sports bra around your father figure. And Kevin stuck up for her, and my mom told Kevin, I think it's time for Bree to go. Kevin didn't like that. I agreed with my mom. She needed to go. She was causing more problems than good. It didn't sit well with Kevin or Bree, obviously. Never in a million years did I think that what happened would happen.
Kevin reached out and asked if we wanted to join him and Lisa at their campsite, myself, my wife, and our 3 kids. And it was wonderful. All the kids were having a blast and just getting to play and interact with each other. But Kevin and Lisa on that trip didn't seem their usual fun-loving selves. There seemed to be something off between them. Kevin and I went off on our own, and I think I had said something in regards to, like, is everything okay? Is there something going on? And he said, well, I gotta tell you, he goes, Lisa has stated to me that she feels that there is something inappropriate going on between myself and Sabrina. Lisa thought that he was pretty much having an affair with Sabrina behind her back. And I pretty much laughed at it. I'm like, yeah, right. I'm like, why is she even thinking something like that? And I even asked him if he wanted me to go and say something to Lisa to reassure her that there was nothing going on between him. And he just asked me to let it go, keep it between us for now, because he didn't want it to create any additional issues or make it uncomfortable during the rest of the trip. So it was just one of those, I just let it go at that point, and it wasn't brought up again while we were out on the trip. Later on in that evening, Kevin and I were outside building a fire, getting things ready for the kids to roast marshmallows and stuff. And Kevin pulled up the waistband of his underwear, and he told me, he said, Sabrina got me these underwear. She said that somebody told her that they were comfortable. I found it weird, and I was like dumbfounded. A foster child wanting to buy, or any child wanting to buy their dad or foster parent a gift that intimate. I didn't know totally how to respond to it, so I just let it go and didn't really think much more about it at that point in time. It was the next morning. Kevin and I were up and we were preparing breakfast for everybody. And Kevin, he goes, let me show you these. He goes, one of the things Sabrina said she wanted to start doing was she wanted to start modeling. He goes, so I started taking some pictures of her to get her like headshots and pictures for modeling. And he pulled up his phone and started flipping through pictures of Sabrina. It was weird to see these types of pictures, almost like he had like with her being so young, but almost like a seductive sort of poses and stuff. It caught me off guard. I'm thinking it's just weird. But I'm like, maybe this isn't anything big. Maybe it's nothing to be concerned about. He was wonderful with children, always wanted to make kids happy. And up until that point, I never saw anything that I thought was irregular or out of the ordinary with him. And it was just one of those that I pushed to the back of my head and just tried to move on to something else and forget about it at the time. I see all the moments totally different now. After what has happened, I mean, all it is I think about everything, and I go back to that trip all the time because I know it's nothing that I did, but I beat myself up daily, and I don't talk about it with people, that I should have looked at things differently when he was telling me that.
So before Kevin left for work the night of the 15th, Bree and Kevin were whispering to each other. It was very odd, but we didn't know what they were saying to each other. I went to sleep around 9. Bree's room was right next to mine. Her phone was blowing up. Text message after text message, and I could hear her receiving the text message. I went in her room and asked her what's going on, and she said nothing. I never heard her phone go off like that before. There were so many text messages it woke me up, but I didn't think anything of it. And then I went to sleep. The morning of November 16th, I heard the dog barking loud and my mom screaming. So I run downstairs, walk in my mom's room, see things knocked over, and Bree stabbing my mom to death. I tried to get her to stop, but then she threatened to stab me. Her face seemed very angry and determined to get the job done. So I backed off and I called 911.
Where's your sister at? Where's your sister? Knock it off! Where is your sister? Quick! What? I got everyone come and say, honey.
This is a photo. This is a photo of the front of the house in Willoughby Hills. Every time I see a picture of the house, it reminds me of the morning my mom died. Flashbacks. Willoughby Hills, please show up. I ran outside, telling them to hurry up. My feet were covered in blood as I ran down the driveway. They pointed a gun at me because they thought it was me. I yelled, "It's not me, she's inside." Sabrina stabbed my mom 178 times. I knew it was bad, and my mom wasn't gonna come out of it alive. I knew that. I knew that. Me, Kevin, and my dad were in a room, and they said my mom passed away. Kevin showed no emotion whatsoever. No crying, no saying anything, just blank. And asking where was Bree and trying to see her, which people thought was very odd, very weird. This person just killed your wife. Why are you going to see her? Trying to see her.
He kept talking about Sabrina, saying he just wanted to make sure she was okay. Yeah, I'm like, that's weird that you want to see her, Kevin. This is the girl that just killed your wife, and why are you so concerned about how she is? I'm starting to see stuff that doesn't seem to be right. He told the officer who he was and told him that he was there to see Sabrina Zunich. The officers advised him at that time that she had no visitation time left. Kevin got upset, got a little loud, got a little angry, said he needed to see her. I had to pretty much pull him back and settle him down because I was worried he was gonna get arrested for acting out in a place like this and yelling and having a fit. So I got him to settle down. He then said, "Okay, can you give her this message?" And he took a piece of paper out that was folded up. He slid it to the officer. The officer took the note, said, "No, we cannot give this to her. We're not allowed to give any notes or anything to her." And he goes, "I can't do this." And he passed it back to Kevin. And then we left. Right there in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, that's not gonna look good with anybody. These are pictures of Kevin and Lisa's room where the murder took place, after the murder took place. Whew. Those are pictures that I don't need to look at because I see them every day in my head. From when I walked into that room and saw that. Oh. Wow. All I see in those pictures when I look at those pictures are what Lisa went through, the suffering she had to went through, the pain to wake up and have somebody on top of you stabbing you. And then I remember blood all over the mattress. It was all over the floors in those pictures. I have to remember that from then. It's just, that is horrific, something I'm never gonna forget. I've seen things like this on TV shows, but to walk in and to actually see this was just, it was unreal. You start thinking, like, how could this have happened?
What do you recall?
Yesterday?
Mm-hmm. Would anything unusual happen?
I don't know.
Remember when we came to the house, you had the knife in your hand.
Are you sure it wasn't self-defense? I don't remember.
Mm-hmm. The two police officers there saw you with the knife and ordered you to drop it.
Did I?
Right.
She doesn't remember anything. That could be. But she knew what she was doing.
Does it make you angry to see her and hear her try and say, oh, are you sure it wasn't self-defense?
Idiot. That's what I think. Because it wasn't. And I know that. My mom was fighting for her life.
Recall coming out of the bedroom with a knife in your hand?
No.
But you had a knife. You stabbed Lisa.
I did.
Yes, you did. And Megan called the police.
That can't be true.
Bree, it is. I'm sorry.
I've never been a murderer.
There's no way she didn't know what she was doing. Sabrina, for the longest time, said it was just like everything went blank and she just went in there and she went into this rage and started doing this. But then I found out later that their youngest daughter was in that room and then ended up being in the closet. So Sabrina had to have gone in there, taken the youngest daughter and placed her in the closet first, and then go back and do what she did. That's not somebody that blacks out and doesn't remember exactly what they're doing.
There were over 900 people at my mom's funeral, and they were hugging me. Half the people I didn't even know. The fact that my mom had an impact on that many people made me happy. Kevin's demeanor at the funeral, no emotion, none. I remember sitting next to a family friend in the front, and Kevin getting up to speak and saying, "Pray for Sabrina," which was really odd. Everyone raised their eyebrow about that one. She just killed your wife.
I was informed by some people that were directly involved with the case and everything that Kevin, that morning, he had already contacted Lisa's job and was inquiring in regards to her life insurance policies that she had and survivor benefits. It's like, who does that kind of thing? I don't think I could have comprehended to do anything like that. That would not have been a first call. And that, when you're hearing that, it's like, Why? And then I found out that there was an investigation by the high school in regards to noted inappropriate behavior between him and Sabrina when he would come pick Sabrina up from school. At that point, I knew the detectives were actually looking into him, so I decided to go to the Willoughby Hills Police Department myself and speak to one of the detectives on the case.
Were you and Lisa in the process of going through a divorce?
Okay, now we're getting outside the scope.
Mm-hmm. Are you going to talk to us about any of the situations that led up to what happened?
I talked to Detective Palmer. He said he wanted to interview him about work, which, I thought was probably a pretext.
Okay.
But, everybody knows where she worked.
Well, we never got to talk at length about the sort of sequence of events and what happened, right? So we're just going to talk about.
His wife was brutally murdered here, and we're trying to help him, help us. He can help us in the investigation.
But, we're not going to get into, the relationship between Kevin and Lisa. It's just, you got a bloody girl with a bloody knife.
You know what, I apologize for wasting your time then, because...
Well, how about your relationship with any of the other children in the household? I mean, how about your relationship with Sabrina?
No.
Kevin?
No.
In this video, it was the same lack of expression that it's been all along. No emotion, straight face. He didn't say a word. The fact that you showed up to the police station with a lawyer in the first place, that's a red flag in itself. He has done something wrong. He's guilty. And we all know it.
This is a picture of the knife that Sabrina used to murder Lisa. Last time I saw a picture of this was at the court hearing. Still had Lisa's blood on it. And this is a serrated knife, and this just shows how horrible the murder was. You have to put a lot of force behind using something like this. She stabbed so many times and so hard with it that it left a permanent bend in the knife from stabbing so hard. That's just, I can't fathom how anybody would stab once or cut even once or twice with a knife like this. It's totally unreal and incomprehensible. I just don't know why it could have gotten to that point where he felt he needed to help facilitate taking Lisa's life. I never saw any problems between him and it was just hard for me to believe that he would actually do something like that. He needed Sabrina to do this, and his way to get her to agree with it was to paint a pretty picture about we can live happily ever after. If we get Lisa out of the picture, if we do this, we're gonna get all this money. Told her how much money it was gonna be, and then we can have our own little family. And she believed that at the time and decided to go along with it. I don't think there was any intention that he was gonna follow through on all that. It was just soulless for him to plan that and to come up with this kind of idea of something to do, thinking that was the only way out of it.
This is the picture of me that reminds me that I testified against my brother. It's a picture of me that reminds me that I helped get him put away for life. I know I did the right thing, but I can't get over the feeling like that I betrayed him.
What we believe from conversations, both with your attorneys and also from our review of the case, is that what led up to this homicide, to this murder, is that there was another party involved in planning that.
Yes. It was Kevin Knaefel, my foster father.
So what made you decide to tell us about Kevin?
Because, for some reason, I'm religious and the truth prevails. And for me to go down for this when I wasn't the only one involved, it didn't seem right. And when you start thinking with your head and not your heart, you realize if somebody loved you, they wouldn't let you go down like that. I was completely manipulated.
Wow. I do believe that Kevin manipulated Bree into killing my mom. But she was dumb enough to fall for it.
Do you believe she's remorseful?
No. I do not believe she's remorseful. It's just an act. No. It's all fake. She decided to speak at Kevin's trial because they told her if she spoke and told the truth, she would get a lighter sentence. Coming forward and telling everyone what Kevin manipulated her into doing. I give her a lot of credit for that. I do. But at the end of the day, she was the one that killed my mom.
It was Kevin's idea, and it was talked about after we were having sexual relations, and him and Lisa were having problems in marriage.
When does he start talking to you about divorce?
It was 3 months before, after he brought up, well, look, I'm gonna kill myself if she doesn't leave because I can't deal with this anymore. When he said that, it kind of triggered me. I was like, no, I don't want that to happen. And so I was like, okay, I'll do it.
In a way, you start feeling bad that she got manipulated into this and taken advantage of for something like this. Never heard these clips before with Sabrina telling her side. This is the first time that I ever heard he said it was either Lisa or he was going to take his own life. And then knowing 2 weeks before that happened, me and my family were with him. When we were out there and all the time he talked with me, he didn't say anything because he probably knew I would have stopped him then if something like that was said, but maybe I could have helped point him in a different direction with something, and none of this could have happened. This is a picture of Sabrina. It's the girl that I knew. It's the girl that I let hang out with my children. And it's just seeing this is just hard to believe that she could have done something so horrible and murdering Lisa. I don't know. I just can't. I can't look at this picture. It bothers me too much. I'm sorry. I can't. And at the same time, too, I'm upset that Sabrina had to deal with all this. She had a rough life, what it was. Yes, what she did is not right. I don't condone it in the least bit. I'm not saying she was right in any measure, what she did was horrible and what it was heinous, but I feel bad for her because she got caught up in this. And no kid should have to go through that. And she's paying a consequence for that because she made the wrong decision from what Kevin had dragged her through. So yes, she was wrong for what she did, but I still feel bad for her from it. And then you just feel bad for Megan, and you feel bad for the youngest daughter. And you feel horrible for Lisa having to go through that.
This is a photo of Kevin. As I can see, no emotion. Like usual. Nothing. I truly believe that Kevin thought he was going to get away with this, yes. He thought he'd never get caught. I don't think Kevin should ever get out of prison, and he needs to spend the rest of his life in prison. He deserves it, and that's where he belongs. He left me and my sister with nothing. No mom, no money. He stole everything from us. He can rot in hell for all I care. Sabrina and Kevin are evil because they took away a mother. Someone who was making a difference in the world. Loved being with their kids, spending time with them. That will never be forgiven. My mental health really took a toll on this. I have flashbacks to that morning pretty frequently. To this day, I trust very little people because you never know what someone is capable of. My life today has its ups and downs. For a while, I struggled with my mental health, anxiety, depression, stuff like that. And I still deal with it, but it's not as bad as it once was. I wish I could have saved my mom and done more. She was the most amazing person anyone would have met. She would do anything for anyone. She loved her kids. She was an amazing mom, an amazing social worker. She was my best friend. And I will never stop telling her story.
The concept of the American dream has always been a powerful, intoxicating force, capable of crossing oceans and piercing through the boundaries of language, culture, and geography. For decades, it has stood as a beacon of hope, promising that through hard work and sheer perseverance, anyone could build a life of prosperity, stability, and dignity. It is a dream packaged and exported to every corner of the globe, often reaching those who are the most vulnerable, the most desperate for a chance to alter their destinies. But there is a dark, shadow side to this promise. When this dream is weaponized, when it is twisted and manipulated by those with predatory intentions, it becomes the ultimate bait. It transforms from a beacon of hope into a carefully constructed trap. This is the story of how that promise was meticulously weaponized to construct a modern-day nightmare, a descent into unimaginable cruelty that would eventually be recognized as the largest human trafficking and modern slavery case dismantled in the judicial history of the United States. To understand the mechanics of this nightmare, we must first look at the geographical and legal anomaly that made it possible. In the vast, open expanse of the South Pacific Ocean lies American Samoa, a small and incredibly remote, unincorporated territory of the United States. Geographically isolated and characterized by its lush volcanic landscapes and deeply rooted Polynesian culture, it seems, on the surface, entirely disconnected from the aggressive, fast-paced industrial machinery of the American mainland. Specifically, the village of Tafuna, positioned as the industrial heart of a territory, operates in a unique space. Because American Samoa is a U.S. territory, goods manufactured there are legally permitted to bear the highly coveted, Made in USA label. This label is not just a geographical marker, it is a powerful symbol of quality and, theoretically, a guarantee of fair labor practices, carrying significant weight in the global market. Furthermore, exporting goods from this territory to the mainland United States is entirely tax-exempt, presenting a massive financial incentive for manufacturers. However, this territory existed in a dangerous legal gray area. While it offered the prestige and economic benefits of American soil, its local labor laws and oversight mechanisms were alarmingly loose, disjointed from the strict regulations that governed factories in places like California or New York. It was a blind spot in the system, a quiet island where the watchful eye of federal labor enforcement rarely turned its gaze. In the late 1990s, a South Korean businessman named Kil-soo Lee looked at this remote Pacific island and did not see a tropical sanctuary. He saw a loophole. He saw an unprecedented opportunity to maximize profit by exploiting the vast chasm between the prestigious, made in USA label and the severe lack of local regulatory oversight. Lee understood that the true cost of manufacturing could be driven down to almost nothing if the labor force was entirely stripped of its rights and isolated from any form of legal recourse. To execute this vision, he established a garment manufacturing facility in Tafuna, naming it Daiwasa Samoa. The factory was designed to be the engine of his burgeoning empire, a facility that would produce clothing for major international brands, all bearing the profitable American tag. But an operation of this scale required a massive workforce, and Lee had no intention of hiring local Samoans who understood their surroundings and had community ties. He needed a workforce that was entirely dependent, completely isolated, and utterly vulnerable. He needed people who could be controlled through fear and debt. To build this captive workforce, Kil-soo Lee engineered a transnational recruitment scheme, setting his sights across the globe on regions where economic hardship was prevalent and the desperate desire for a better life could be easily exploited. He partnered with a network of labor export companies, essentially creating a pipeline of human capital. His primary targets were young women, predominantly from Vietnam, along with a smaller number of workers from China. These women were specifically chosen because of their socioeconomic vulnerabilities. In the late 1990s, for a young woman living in a struggling rural province, the prospect of overseas work was often the only viable lifeline to lift her entire extended family out of poverty. The recruitment pitch was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation, carefully calibrated to hit every note of aspiration and desperation. The recruiters painted a picture of absolute prosperity. The women were promised a monthly salary ranging from $400 to $500. In the context of the late 1990s in Vietnam, this was not just a good wage. It was an astronomical sum, an amount of money that could fundamentally change the trajectory of a family's future. It meant the ability to send younger siblings to school, to rebuild dilapidated homes, and to secure a comfortable old age for their parents. Beyond the money, they were sold the allure of the destination itself. They were told they were going to an American territory, implying modern living conditions, safety, legal protections, and the tantalizing possibility of future resettlement and immigration. It was framed not just as a job, but as the ultimate opportunity, a golden ticket to the American dream. However, the cost of entry into this fabricated paradise was deliberately set at a ruinous level. To secure their spot in this supposedly life-changing program, the women were required to pay an exorbitant recruitment fee, an upfront deposit ranging from $5,000 to $8,000. This was an impossible sum for women who were seeking the job precisely because they were impoverished. To raise this money, the women and their families had to resort to extreme measures. They were forced to take out massive loans, borrowing from informal lenders at crippling interest rates. Most devastatingly, many families had to surrender their property deeds, signing away the very land they lived on as collateral. Before they even packed their bags, before they even stepped onto a plane, these young women were already shackled by a colossal, crushing debt. This debt was not merely a financial obligation, it was the psychological chain that Kil-soo Lee would use to bind them. They were leaving their homes knowing that if they failed, if they returned empty-handed, their families would lose everything, facing absolute destitution and homelessness. They were carrying the weight of their family's survival on their shoulders. With the loans secured and the fees paid, over 200 Vietnamese women, alongside their Chinese counterparts, embarked on the long, disorienting journey across the Pacific. They left behind everything familiar: their language, their families, their culture, fueled only by the desperate hope of the promises they had been given. They envisioned a modern, bustling American factory, clean dormitories, and a hard but fair life that would eventually lead to their financial liberation. The reality of Tafuna shattered this illusion the moment they arrived. The brutal machinery of Kill Soo Lee's trap snapped shut with terrifying speed and efficiency. Upon their arrival at the Daiwasa Samoa compound, there was no welcoming orientation, no settlement into modern accommodations. Instead, they were immediately subjected to the first and most critical step of their subjugation. Every single worker was ordered to hand over their passports, their identification papers, and their return tickets. In an instant, their legal identities were erased. Without their passports, they ceased to be international workers with rights. They became ghosts trapped on a tiny speck of land in the middle of a vast ocean. The geography that had once sounded like a tropical paradise now revealed itself as a flawless, natural prison. American Samoa is located thousands of miles away from the mainland United States and equally far from Southeast Asia. Even if they somehow managed to escape the factory grounds, where could they go? They spoke no English, they did not speak the local Samoan language, they had no money, and they had no legal documentation to prove who they were. The island itself was a fortress, surrounded by thousands of miles of deep blue water. As the factory gates closed behind them, the promised American dream dissolved into a horrifying reality. The Daiwasa factory was not a place of opportunity, it was a carefully designed apparatus of exploitation. The women had walked willingly into a system of modern-day slavery, engineered by a man who viewed their humanity merely as an operational cost to be minimized. The enormous debts they left behind in their home villages, the confiscation of their only means of identification, and the extreme physical isolation of the island converged to strip them of all agency. They were entirely at the mercy of Kill Soo Lee. The factory floor awaited them, and the descent into a relentless, brutalizing nightmare was about to begin, transforming the sunny shores of an American territory into a dark, unforgiving hell that would test the absolute limits of human endurance and survival. The confiscation of their passports was merely the psychological prelude to the physical reality that awaited the women inside the Daiwasa Samoa compound. The grandiose promises of modern American living conditions, carefully curated and aggressively marketed by the recruiters back in Vietnam, evaporated the very moment the workers were led to their actual living quarters. Instead of the clean, respectable, and comfortable dormitories they had envisioned and paid so dearly for, the women were herded into squalid, damp encampments that more closely resembled a forgotten penal colony than a residential facility for international labor. The physical environment was immediately oppressive and deeply disorienting. American Samoa possesses a profoundly humid, tropical climate, and the living quarters provided absolutely no respite from the sweltering, heavy environment. The air inside the cramped, poorly constructed barracks was thick, stagnant, and constantly heavy with moisture, creating a permanent state of physical discomfort that clung to their skin. The women, already deeply exhausted from their traumatic, multi-leg journey across the Pacific Ocean and still reeling from the profound shock of having their legal identities stripped away, found themselves packed tightly into these miserable, unventilated spaces. They were forced to exist in an environment that systematically degraded their human dignity from the very first night. The perimeter of their new, terrifying world was rigidly defined by imposing, heavily fortified fences topped with sharp, glinting coils of barbed wire. It became immediately apparent that this was not a standard security measure designed to keep unauthorized intruders out of a commercial property. It was a psychological and physical barrier engineered specifically to keep the captive workers securely locked inside. The severe visual impact of the barbed wire served as a constant, silent, and deeply threatening reminder of their complete captivity, reinforcing the horrifying realization that they had not traveled across the world for a lucrative job opportunity, but had instead walked willingly into a meticulously constructed, inescapable cage. To ensure absolute, unquestioning compliance, and to swiftly extinguish any fleeting thoughts of organization or escape, Kil-Soo Lee implemented a rigorous, unyielding system of surveillance and intimidation. The factory compound was heavily monitored by a dedicated team of local security guards who patrolled the perimeter, the factory floors, and the living quarters 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The constant, looming presence of these guards created an atmosphere of pervasive fear, paranoia, and deep psychological distress. The women were never truly alone. Every physical movement, every whispered conversation in the dark, every quiet moment of despair was subjected to the watchful, hostile eyes of their captors. This relentless, suffocating surveillance stripped away the final, fragile remnants of their personal privacy and individual autonomy, cementing their status not as contracted employees, but as vulnerable inmates trapped within a 20th-century concentration camp. Furthermore, the extreme geographical and linguistic isolation of the facility meant that their desperate cries for help would never reach the outside world. They were completely cut off from the local Samoan community, unable to communicate their plight due to the immense language barrier. They were trapped in a highly controlled, authoritarian microenvironment where the only applicable law was the absolute, unchallenged will of Kil-Soo Lee. The guards acted as the brutal enforcers of this regime, ensuring that the physical boundaries of the compound were strictly maintained and that any minor infraction, any sign of hesitation, was met with immediate intimidation. The physical confinement was absolute, turning the lush, vibrant tropical surroundings of the remote island into a cruel, mocking backdrop to their profound, hidden suffering. If the damp, overcrowded living quarters were a prison, the factory floor was an unrelenting, deafening engine of physical exploitation and misery. The women were abruptly thrust into a grueling, inhumane labor schedule that completely disregarded fundamental labor rights, basic human physical limitations, and any sense of moral decency. They were forced to work agonizingly long shifts lasting between 12 and 14 hours every single day, with absolutely no days off permitted under any circumstances. The very concepts of a weekend, of physical rest, of sick leave, or of mental recovery were entirely eradicated from their daily existence. They worked 7 days a week, week after week, in an environment specifically designed to extract the maximum possible output with zero regard for their physical or mental well-being. The working conditions inside the manufacturing facility were nothing short of agonizing. The intense, oppressive tropical heat of the South Pacific, combined with the severe lack of proper industrial ventilation and the constant, radiating warmth generated by hundreds of heavy-duty sewing machines, transformed the enclosed factory floor into a suffocating, unbearable oven. The women sat hunched over their cramped workstations for more than half a day, their bodies constantly aching, their backs protesting, their hands moving with desperate, mechanical repetition as they produced thousands of garments destined for the highly lucrative American retail market. Sweat poured relentlessly down their faces as they fought through profound physical exhaustion, driven only by the desperate, clinging hope that their agonizing labor would eventually be rewarded with the substantial salaries they had been explicitly promised. However, the most fundamentally cruel aspect of this relentless toil was the complete and total absence of compensation. The grand promises of $400 to $500 a month proved to be nothing more than a vicious, calculated lie. Kil-Soo Lee systematically and deliberately withheld their wages, allowing long, grueling months to pass without paying the workers a single cent for their 14-hour days of backbreaking labor. They were pouring their youth, their health, and their life force into his machinery, generating immense financial profits for his enterprise, while receiving absolutely nothing in return. As the long, agonizing months dragged on without a single paycheck, the horrific reality of their situation deepened drastically as Kil-Soo Lee began to actively weaponize their basic human need for sustenance. In a cold, calculated effort to ruthlessly slash operational costs and maximize his own profit margins to the absolute limit, Lee drastically reduced the daily food rations provided to the captive workforce. The meals, which were fundamentally necessary to sustain them through their punishing, calorie-burning 14-hour shifts in the intense heat, rapidly devolved into a grotesque form of slow, deliberate starvation. The women were routinely provided with nothing more than small portions of plain white rice swimming in dirty, completely unseasoned water. This catastrophic lack of basic nutrition began to ravage their bodies with terrifying speed. Severe malnutrition set in rapidly, compounding the immense physical exhaustion caused by the endless hours of repetitive manual labor. The sheer, gnawing desperation of chronic, hollow hunger drove the women to heartbreaking, degrading lengths just to survive another day. In the brief, strictly monitored moments they were allowed outside their damp barracks, the starving workers would desperately scour the dirt along the interior base of the barbed wire fences, searching frantically for any wild, edible weeds, roots, or stray vegetation they could forage to somehow supplement their miserable, watery rations. When meat was occasionally provided by the factory management, it was an egregious insult to their suffering and a severe hazard to their health. In a display of extreme negligence and horrifying cruelty, the kitchen would serve the workers' chicken that was completely rotten, foul-smelling, and heavily spoiled. Consuming this tainted, decaying meat inevitably resulted in severe outbreaks of food poisoning, intense nausea, diarrhea, and agonizing physical illness that swept through the cramped dormitories. Yet, the women were so profoundly starved, their bodies so desperate for any form of protein, that they were forced to consume the rotten food just to put something solid in their painful, empty stomachs, sacrificing their physical health merely to temporarily numb the overwhelming, consuming pain of starvation. The most insidious and deeply destructive aspect of Kill Sue Lee's operation was not just the physical imprisonment, the wage theft, or the deliberate starvation. It was the sophisticated psychological terror he continuously utilized to maintain absolute, unquestioned control over a starving, unpaid, and desperate workforce. Whenever the workers reached their absolute physical and mental breaking points, whenever the profound exhaustion, the gnawing hunger, and the deep despair pushed them to quietly question their horrendous conditions or softly beg for their rightfully earned wages, Lee wielded the ultimate, devastating weapon of coercion. He did not always need to immediately resort to direct physical violence to suppress their dissent. Instead, he continuously and aggressively threatened them with immediate deportation back to their home countries. To fully understand the catastrophic, paralyzing weight of this specific threat, one must deeply consider the enormous, crippling financial debts these young women carried on their shoulders. Returning to Vietnam was not a rescue mission or a return to safety. It was an absolute, undeniable death sentence for their families' entire futures. If they were deported and sent back empty-handed, labeled as failures, the aggressive loan sharks and local creditors waiting in their home rural villages would immediately seize the property deeds, the family homes, and the land titles their parents had desperately mortgaged to pay the initial recruitment fees. Their aging parents, their younger siblings, would be instantly rendered homeless and utterly destitute, plunged into a cycle of poverty from which they could never recover. Kill Sue Lee understood this complex socioeconomic dynamic perfectly and exploited it with surgical precision. He knew intimately that the massive recruitment fees they had paid were the very invisible chains that securely bound them to his factory floor. By constantly threatening deportation, he was effectively holding their entire families hostage from thousands of miles across the ocean. This intense psychological manipulation successfully induced a state of complete, helpless paralysis among the workers. They were trapped in a horrifying, inescapable paradox. They were being actively starved, degraded, and worked to the absolute brink of death in an American territory, yet the sheer, overwhelming terror of returning home as financial failures, of single-handedly destroying their families' lives, forced them to silently endure the unendurable. They swallowed their agonizing hunger, wiped away their exhausted sweat in the suffocating heat of the factory floor, and continued to mechanically operate the heavy sewing machines, tightly bound in a complex, modern-day system of slavery that fed entirely on their deep love for their families and their desperate, unyielding vulnerability. The descent into the absolute depths of the nightmare at Daiwasa occurred in the sweltering, humid month of November in the year 2000. By this point, the reality of the situation for the Vietnamese workers had moved past the point of endurance. They had existed for months in a state of chronic, hollow-bellied starvation, their bodies withered and their spirits battered by the unrelenting, grueling physical toil that never ceased. They had been promised a better life, but they had received nothing but the harsh, unforgiving reality of a forced labor camp. Month after month had vanished into the oppressive heat of the factory floor, and not once had they seen a single payment of their promised wages. The financial security they had sacrificed everything to achieve was now a distant, cruel memory, replaced by the immediate, biting necessity of survival. The mental and physical toll of their confinement had reached a critical threshold, where the fear of what might happen if they spoke out was finally being eclipsed by the undeniable, agonizing reality of their current existence. There was a palpable shift in the air of the factory, a growing, shared awareness among the workers that the status quo could no longer continue. The silence that had previously been enforced by the guards and the constant, suffocating threat of deportation began to break, replaced by hushed, urgent conversations among the women in the damp, crowded dormitories at night. They were no longer willing to silently accept their role as mere commodities in Kill Soo Lee's empire of exploitation. They were hungry, they were exhausted, and they were fundamentally broken, but they were still human beings with a last, desperate, flickering spark of dignity. On that fateful November day, the breaking point arrived with a quiet, collective resolve that transformed the factory floor. The workers, driven by the absolute exhaustion of their situation and the visceral, gnawing pain of their hunger, decided to take a unified stand. In a rare, high-stakes moment of collective action, the Vietnamese women across the factory floor simply stopped their work. They did not shout, they did not riot, and they did not engage in any form of physical destruction. They merely ceased to be the mechanical extensions of the sewing machines. They stood up from their stations and, in a unified, silent protest, refused to continue the production cycle. It was a brave, desperate, and fundamentally nonviolent act of defiance. They were not demanding power or political change. They were simply demanding the most basic, fundamental requirements of their humanity. They wanted to be fed properly, and they wanted to be paid for the thousands of hours of labor they had already performed. It was a plea for justice, a desperate cry for their contract to be honored, and a final, frantic attempt to escape the cycle of starvation and abuse that was slowly destroying them. They stood in the center of the factory, their faces drawn and gaunt, their hands trembling with the exhaustion of months of labor, waiting for someone in power to finally listen. They were waiting for a negotiation, for a concession, for even the smallest, most basic show of respect from the man who had brought them to this island. However, the man they had expected to encounter, the businessman, the entrepreneur, the leader of a made-in-USA operation, was nowhere to be found in the reaction that followed. Kill Soo Lee's response was not one of dialogue, empathy, or even basic administrative concern. He did not see his employees. He saw a breach in his operational efficiency that needed to be forcibly corrected. He did not perceive their hunger as a human failure to address. He saw their protest as an act of insubordination that demanded an immediate, severe, and public punishment. He viewed the workers not as human beings who had sacrificed everything for his project, but as property that had become difficult to control. In a chilling decision that would forever solidify the true nature of his operation, Lee chose not to negotiate, not to provide food, and not to address the wage issue. Instead, he made the deliberate, calculated decision to crush their spirit through overwhelming, brutal force. He turned to his team of local managers and the hired, security-focused muscle he kept on hand to maintain his regime of terror. He issued a cold, direct order to the security team. They were to enter the factory and the living quarters and, by any means necessary, teach these slaves a lesson that would ensure they never thought of defiance again. The violence that ensued was not a skirmish. It was a premeditated, systematic act of physical cruelty. The security team, composed of large, physically imposing men, arrived at the factory not to maintain order, but to inflict pain. They came prepared for their task, armed with heavy, industrial-grade iron pipes and thick, wooden bats. The scene that unfolded on the factory floor was one of pure, unadulterated horror, a graphic manifestation of the absolute powerlessness of the workers. The security guards, under the explicit direction of Kil-Soo Lee's management, did not hesitate to use their weapons on the women who stood before them. They moved through the factory, swinging the iron pipes and bats with brutal, unrelenting force, targeting any woman who had participated in the stoppage. The sound of the metal hitting flesh and bone echoed through the manufacturing hall, a sickening, jarring rhythm that replaced the steady hum of the sewing machines. The women, caught entirely off guard by the sheer, unbridled ferocity of the attack, were completely unable to defend themselves. They were not combatants. They were malnourished, exhausted individuals who were, at that very moment, struggling to stand on their own feet. They were beaten mercilessly, tossed to the floor, and struck again and again as the guards sought to make a point that would be felt by every single person in the compound. The carnage on the factory floor was complete and devastating. The floors, once a clean, clinical space where thousands of garments were produced, became slick with the blood of the workers. Many of the women suffered from broken bones, including fractured arms and ribs, as they instinctively tried to shield themselves from the onslaught. Others sustained terrifying, blunt force trauma to their heads and upper bodies, leading to concussions and internal injuries that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Among the many victims of this night of terror, one case stood out for its particular, visceral, and permanent cruelty. The worker Truong T. Le Guin became the most harrowing symbol of the night's violence. She was targeted directly by one of the facility's managers, who wielded an iron pipe with the explicit, focused intention of inflicting maximum damage. He struck her directly in the face with the full force of his swing. The impact was so severe, so fundamentally violent, that it caused her eye to be completely forced out of its socket. The image was a horrifying testament to the absolute depravity of the management. In that single, sickening moment of violence, the manager had effectively and permanently destroyed Gwen's ability to see from that eye, leaving her permanently maimed and physically scarred. The factory, intended to be a place of production, had transformed into a theater of agony. The air, which had previously been filled with the sounds of machinery, was now entirely consumed by the harrowing, high-pitched wails of women in the depths of unimaginable physical and psychological pain. The crying, the desperate, broken sobbing of over 200 women echoed through the halls of the factory and the surrounding barracks, a testament to the horror that had been unleashed. The night of the beating was a defining moment in the history of the facility, a night where the mask of a legitimate business operation was completely ripped away, revealing the naked, brutal truth of the slavery that had been occurring in the heart of Tafuna. The guards and the management moved through the scene with a cold, terrifying detachment, showing no remorse for the damage they had wrought on the women who had come to them seeking only the opportunity to earn a living. The violence was not an accident. It was a deliberate, controlled, and executed strategy intended to break the spirit of the workers, to ensure that they understood their position in the hierarchy, and to demonstrate that there was no power, no authority, and no law on the island that could protect them from the will of Kil-Soo Lee. As the night passed and the cries of the injured slowly faded into a hollow, defeated silence, the reality settled over the compound like a heavy, suffocating shroud. Their humanity had been stripped away, and they were now truly, completely alone. The promise of the American dream was nowhere to be found. In its place was a reality of blood, of broken bones, of permanently stolen senses, and of the absolute, crushing realization that they were the captives of a man who saw no value in their lives beyond what he could extract from their physical toil. The night of the violence was the moment the dream truly died, leaving them only to survive in the wreckage that remained. The night of the beating at Daiwasa left an indelible mark of terror upon every worker within the compound, but it also inadvertently shattered the absolute, airtight seal of silence that Kil-Soo Lee had so meticulously maintained. For months, the geographic isolation of the island, The lack of language access and the crushing psychological weight of family debt had served as an impenetrable barrier, keeping the horrors of the factory hidden from the outside world. However, the sheer, unbridled brutality of that November evening created a fracture in the armor. As the women nursed their broken bones and tended to their traumatic injuries in the darkness of their barracks, the shared experience of such profound, physical violation began to transcend the paralyzing fear that had previously dictated their every action. The pain was so acute, and the realization of their absolute lack of human value in the eyes of their captors so profound, that the internal hierarchy of fear began to reorganize. A few courageous individuals, driven by the desperate understanding that their situation could not possibly get any worse and that their survival now depended on external intervention, began to reach out beyond the electrified, barbed wire boundaries of the compound. Through a combination of clandestine efforts, involving the aid of compassionate members of the local Samoan community and persistent individuals within local church organizations who had observed the unusual, heavily fortified nature of the compound, the first fragments of the truth began to reach the ears of those who possessed the power to act. These early, tentative reports were not initially understood in their full, harrowing scope. They were whispered stories of mistreatment, of withheld wages, and of a general environment of fear. Yet, even in their fragmented form, these accounts were sufficient to pique the interest of local activists and human rights advocates who had long been suspicious of the secretive, high-security operations behind the Daiwasa factory walls. The turning point occurred when these whispers, supported by the terrifying physical evidence of the workers' conditions, finally reached the desk of federal investigators. The United States government, specifically through the investigative power of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, launched a comprehensive, high-stakes inquiry into the operations at Daiwasa. This was not a routine audit or a simple labor inspection. It was a deep, systematic, and aggressive investigation into organized human trafficking, modern slavery, and a host of associated criminal enterprises. The federal agents arrived at the island with the full weight of the American justice system, prepared to dismantle the infrastructure of the exploitation that Kill Sue Lee had built. For the agents, the investigation was an arduous, complex, and deeply revealing process. They had to navigate a language barrier that was initially so severe they had to rely entirely on interpreters to even begin to gain the trust of the workers. Every conversation was a slow, painful, and deeply sensitive process of peeling back layers of profound, embedded trauma. The women, who had been conditioned to believe that their captors held ultimate power over their lives and their families' futures, were initially terrified to speak. They feared that any information they provided would lead to immediate retaliation, that they would be sent back to their villages as disgraced failures, or that they would be physically harmed if the agents failed to fully dismantle Lee's network. The investigators had to exercise extreme, tactical patience, working to prove to the women that they were, in fact, protected by the authority of the American government and that they would never be forced back into the clutches of their captors. As the investigation intensified, the agents systematically collected the evidence that would eventually seal Kill Sue Lee's fate. They conducted exhaustive, covert surveillance of the factory grounds, documenting the inhuman living conditions, the constant, oppressive security presence, and the sheer, physical reality of the workers' captivity. They examined the factory's financial records, uncovering a complex, sophisticated web of fraud, money laundering, and illegal wage theft that had allowed Lee to operate his empire while keeping his employees in a state of absolute, abject poverty. The agents also conducted formal interviews with the women, carefully recording their accounts of the physical violence, the systematic starvation, and the constant, coercive threats that had been utilized to maintain their obedience. Each interview was a piece of a larger, terrifying puzzle. The testimony provided by Truong T. Le Guin and others who had been directly subjected to the violence on that November night provided the irrefutable, physical evidence of the cruelty that had been systematically practiced within the factory walls. The agents were no longer investigating a simple case of labor mismanagement. They were documenting a systematic, industrial-scale crime against humanity. The evidence was overwhelming, and it provided a chilling insight into the mind of a man who had treated human beings as mere, disposable components in a quest for and accumulation of wealth. The investigation was not without its strategic hurdles, as Lee had taken significant, calculated steps to insulate himself from the daily, brutal reality of his factory floor. He often delegated the physical violence to his managers, attempting to create a layer of deniability between his own orders and the actions taken by his security team. However, the federal investigators were relentless, meticulously building a case that would connect the structural, systemic exploitation of the workers directly back to the instructions and the deliberate policy decisions made by Kil-Soo Lee. They built a case that would stand up in a federal court, a case that left no room for legal loopholes or excuses. The final phase of the investigation was the execution of the federal intervention. The FBI, working in concert with the United States Department of Justice, orchestrated a massive, coordinated effort to take control of the Daewoo facility. They arrived at the factory not just to conduct further inquiries, but to decisively end the operation. They secured the site, immediately removed the security guards, and transitioned the workers from their status as captives to victims and protected witnesses of a federal criminal case. The scene of the intervention was a stark, undeniable moment of liberation. For the workers, the arrival of the federal agents was an almost incomprehensible shift in their reality. After months of believing they were absolutely alone, completely forgotten, and entirely at the mercy of their captors, they were suddenly surrounded by the authority of a system that was committed to their safety. The transition process was incredibly complex and deeply emotional. The government had to provide immediate, basic humanitarian assistance to hundreds of women who were malnourished, traumatized, and in many cases, suffering from untreated physical injuries sustained during their confinement. They were relocated to temporary, secure facilities where they could finally begin to receive adequate medical care, proper nutrition, and the psychological support necessary to start the long, painful process of recovery. The federal agents, in their commitment to justice, ensured that the workers were treated with dignity and respect, a profound, transformative contrast to the treatment they had received for so long. The legal strategy that the Department of Justice developed to hold Kil-Soo Lee accountable was a masterclass in thorough, patient, and uncompromising legal work. They focused not only on the physical acts of violence but on the systemic, coercive environment that Lee had created, recognizing that the violence was merely the final instrument of control in a broader, more deeply rooted crime of trafficking. They aimed to charge him with the full spectrum of his activities, from the initial fraudulent recruitment and the illegal confiscation of travel documents to the systematic forced labor and the financial exploitation of his workforce. They understood that to achieve true justice, they needed to show the court that this was not a series of isolated events but a coherent, deliberate, and sustained project of exploitation. The investigation spanned months of work, involving thousands of pages of documents, hundreds of witness statements, and the systematic, piece-by-piece assembly of a narrative that would make Lee's culpability undeniable. During this time, Kil-Soo Lee found himself under increasing pressure as the federal net tightened around him. He faced the reality that his status, his wealth, and his calculated, industrial-scale manipulation were no longer sufficient to shield him from the scrutiny of the American law. The investigative phase concluded with the formal filing of federal charges, a moment that was both a culmination of the agents' tireless efforts and the beginning of a new, equally critical phase of the process. The investigators had successfully transitioned the case from a secretive, distant nightmare on a remote Pacific island to the center of the American legal system, where the truth would finally be brought into the clear, unforgiving light of the court. The efforts of the federal government had not only provided a lifeline to the women, but had also set a new, vital precedent for the investigation of human trafficking and modern slavery within the jurisdiction of the United States. They had proven that no matter how remote, how obscured, or how cleverly disguised, the system was capable of reaching in, identifying the abuse, and dismantling the structures of human suffering. The evidence was secured, the witnesses were protected, and the legal framework was in place to ensure that the man who had built his empire on the misery of hundreds would finally have to face the consequences of his actions before a court of law. The investigation was not merely about individual punishment. It was a profound, systemic assertion of human rights and the inherent dignity of labor, a clear, unmistakable statement that the practices at Daiwasa were completely and absolutely unacceptable in any society that laid claim to the values of justice, equality, and the rule of law. The groundwork for the final, definitive reckoning had been laid, and the path to justice, though long and agonizing for those who had lived the nightmare, was now clearly, finally, open. The transition from the investigative phase to the courtroom was a profound shift, moving the focus from the dark, confined reality of the Tafuna factory to the formal, structured environment of the United States federal judicial system. Kil-Soo Lee, who had operated with absolute, unchecked authority in the Pacific, suddenly found himself confined within a system where his wealth, his influence, and his manipulative tactics held no sway. The legal proceedings were held in Honolulu, Hawaii, a city that provided the necessary jurisdictional authority to address the federal crimes committed within the territory of American Samoa. The atmosphere of the trial was heavy with the weight of the testimony that was about to be presented. It was not merely a criminal trial, but a public, formal accounting of the systematic dehumanization of hundreds of women. The legal team representing the United States government approached the prosecution with a meticulous, surgical precision, understanding that they were not just fighting for conviction, but for the validation of the experiences of every worker who had survived the Daiwasa compound. The prosecution focused on presenting a cohesive narrative that connected the dots between the initial predatory recruitment practices, the systematic, deliberate confiscation of human agency, and the eventual resort to physical violence to maintain the status quo. The courtroom became the stage where the facade of Kil-Soo Lee's business was completely dismantled. Witness after witness took the stand, their voices, though initially trembling with the trauma of their experiences, becoming firm as they detailed the reality of the daily life they had endured. The testimony provided by the survivors was the heart and soul of the prosecution's case. They described the cramped, damp conditions, the constant, pervasive hunger that gnawed at their physical strength, and the relentless, mechanical labor they were forced to perform. The survivors spoke with a harrowing, intimate clarity about the psychological toll of being trapped, of being treated as commodities, and of the paralyzing, crushing fear that had kept them silent for so long. The testimony regarding the November night of violence was particularly devastating. The survivors described the cold, detached manner in which the security team had been deployed, the sound of the metal pipes striking the barracks, and the chaotic, desperate scenes of injury and agony that had ensued. The detailed account of the injury suffered by Truong T. Le Guin, a permanent, physical reminder of the factory's cruelty, forced the court and the jury to confront the absolute, graphic reality of the brutality that had occurred. The prosecution ensured that these testimonies were not merely a collection of stories, but a structured, systematic record of the crimes that had been committed under Lee's orders. Throughout the trial, the defense team for Kil-Soo Lee attempted to construct a narrative of the business as a legitimate, struggling enterprise that had been misunderstood and unfairly targeted. They tried to frame the actions of the security team as isolated, unauthorized incidents of excessive force that had been conducted without Lee's direct knowledge or approval. They attempted to distance Lee from the daily, brutal reality of the factory floor, portraying him as a distant, administrative figure who was focused on the albeit difficult demands of global manufacturing. However, the prosecution's evidence was insurmountable. They presented internal documentation, communication records, and testimony from former management staff that explicitly and directly linked Lee to every critical decision, from the initial recruitment fees and the confiscation of passports to the deliberate reduction of food rations and the authorization of the security force. The prosecution effectively demonstrated that the violence was not a series of unauthorized outbursts, but the natural, inevitable, and intended result of the system Lee had created. The systemic, coercive environment was his direct, calculated policy, and the evidence left no room for the defense's attempts to portray him as a detached participant. The trial was an exhaustive process, stretching over a significant period of time to ensure that every aspect of the criminal enterprise was thoroughly examined. The jury, faced with the overwhelming and graphic evidence of the systemic abuse, had to grapple with the sheer scale of the cruelty that had been practiced. The prosecution strategy was to keep the jury focused on the human experience of the victims, ensuring that the legal arguments never lost sight of the fundamental, moral, and criminal reality of the case. They successfully argued that Kil-Soo Lee's actions were not merely a breach of contract or a failure in labor management, but a deliberate, calculated, and sustained violation of the most fundamental human rights. As the trial progressed, the narrative of the Daewoo factory became increasingly clear. It was a modern-day, industrial-scale site of slavery, carefully constructed to maximize profit by systematically stripping 200 women of their humanity, their freedom, and their dignity. The defense's attempts to deflect blame became increasingly strained, struggling to provide any credible justification for the systematic, documented abuse that the prosecution had presented to the court. By the time the proceedings reached the point of the final arguments, the reality of Kil-Soo Lee's guilt was undeniable. The prosecution's closing arguments were a powerful, clear summary of the systematic, cold-hearted exploitation that had defined the operation. They reminded the jury that the case was not about a failed business venture, but about the fundamental, absolute duty of the law to protect the vulnerable from those who would use their power to treat human lives as expendable, profitable assets. They emphasized that the law had to serve as a strong, unequivocal deterrent against the sort of systemic cruelty that Lee had practiced. The jury, after a period of intense deliberation, returned with a verdict that was a clear, unambiguous, and profoundly significant statement. Kil-Soo Lee was found guilty on a wide range of federal charges, including, most centrally, involuntary servitude, human trafficking, kidnapping, extortion, and money laundering. The verdict was a landmark decision in the history of the American justice system, reflecting the gravity and the systemic nature of the crimes that had been committed. In 2005, the court reached the stage of sentencing, a moment that was the culmination of years of investigation, legal struggle, and the long, painful path to justice for the survivors. The judge, in handing down the sentence, acknowledged the devastating, systemic nature of the crimes and the profound, life-altering impact that the actions of Kil-Soo Lee had had on the hundreds of women who had been subjected to his regime. The sentence was a strong, clear, and unambiguous condemnation of the actions he had taken. Kil-Soo Lee was sentenced to 40 years in federal prison. This was a severe, appropriate, and historically significant sentence, one that reflected the court's recognition that his crimes were not merely the result of bad management or a difficult market, but the product of a deliberate, calculated, and sustained, and deeply immoral, criminal endeavor. The sentence was meant to reflect the full, devastating reality of his actions, from the initial, predatory recruitment to the final, graphic, and permanent, physical destruction of the survivors' lives. In addition to the prison sentence, the court also imposed heavy financial penalties, ordering Kil-Soo Lee to pay millions of dollars in restitution to the victims who had suffered through the nightmare. While no amount of money could ever undo the trauma, the physical, permanent injuries, or the years of lost potential that the women had experienced, the court-ordered restitution was a vital, necessary step in the process of attempting to provide some level of formal, financial acknowledgement of the profound harm that had been inflicted. The managers and security staff who had participated in the physical abuse and the enforcement of the forced labor regime also received significant prison sentences, reflecting the court's understanding that the infrastructure of exploitation relied on the willing, active participation of individuals who had chosen to implement and enforce the cruel, abusive policies that Lee had designed. The trial and the resulting sentences were a definitive, formal reckoning with the reality of what had occurred at Daewoo. It was an assertion of the rule of law, a clear statement that the fundamental, inherent dignity of every human being is protected by the justice system, and that those who seek to profit by systematically, aggressively stripping others of that dignity will face the full, unyielding force of the law. The verdict and the sentence were, for the survivors, the final, crucial component in their long, agonizing journey, providing them with the sense of formal, institutional justice that was essential for their ability to finally start the process of moving past the horror of the Tafuna compound and attempting, in whatever ways they could, to rebuild their lives in the aftermath. The trial had brought the darkness of the Pacific Factory into the clear, analytical, and fair light of the federal court, ensuring that the truth was not only revealed, but officially and definitively established. The unraveling of the Daiwusa factory nightmare, while culminating in a resounding victory for the justice system and a definitive prison sentence for Kil Soo Lee, was merely the beginning of an infinitely more complex and arduous journey for the survivors. The legacy of the Daiwusa tragedy is not just a chapter in legal history. It is a profound, lingering scar on the lives of over 200 women who, through no fault of their own, were stripped of their autonomy, their dignity, and the precious years of their youth. The aftermath of the case was characterized by the systemic, institutional recognition of their status as victims of human trafficking and modern slavery. The federal government, in a rare and essential demonstration of commitment to the protection of those who had been so profoundly exploited, granted the survivors special T visas. These visas were not just legal documents. They were a lifeline, a formal acknowledgement that the women had been victims of a severe criminal enterprise and that their continued safety and recovery were of significant interest to the United States. This status allowed them to remain in the United States, providing them with the opportunity to escape the immense, crushing debt that had once held them hostage, and to begin the monumental task of rebuilding their lives in a world that was vastly different from the rural villages they had left behind. However, the psychological, emotional, and physical aftermath of such extreme, systemic abuse is not something that can be simply resolved through legal status or financial restitution. The trauma of the Daiwusa experience was deeply embedded, an internal, pervasive shadow that followed the survivors long after the factory gates were locked and the legal proceedings concluded. Many of the women carried the physical, permanent consequences of their abuse. The injuries sustained during the November night of violence, the broken bones, the internal trauma, the permanent loss of sight for those like Truong T. Le Guin, were lifelong, inescapable reminders of their time in the Tafuna compound. These physical limitations were constantly paired with the internal, psychological burden of their experiences. For years, they had been subjected to an environment where their most basic human needs were weaponized, where their trust had been exploited, and where they had been conditioned to believe that their lives held no value beyond the labor they could perform. The process of learning to trust again, of reclaiming a sense of individual agency, and of finding the strength to envision a future that was not defined by the shadows of the past, was a slow, uneven, and deeply painful journey that demanded an immense, sustained, and often overwhelming degree of internal resilience. The Daiwusa case also serves as a sobering, enduring, and essential reflection on the nature of exploitation in our modern, globalized economy. It is a stark reminder that the pursuit of profit, when decoupled from moral accountability and effective regulatory oversight, can lead to the most extreme, dehumanizing, and grotesque forms of human suffering. The exploitation of the workers was made possible not by a lack of law, but by a lack of rigorous, consistent, and proactive enforcement in a geographic blind spot. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that even within the jurisdiction of highly developed, democratic, and law-abiding nations, there exist vulnerable spaces where the most fundamental human rights can be effectively, systematically suppressed in the service of efficiency and profit. The legacy of the case is a powerful call to action for the persistent, ongoing development of more effective, transnational, and vigilant mechanisms to protect the most vulnerable laborers from the predatory reach of those who would see them only as commodities. It highlights the absolute, essential necessity of global labor standards, the requirement for robust, consistent oversight, and the importance of ensuring that the mechanisms of global trade do not become the conduits for the perpetuation of modern-day slavery. As we look back at the history of the Daiwusa factory, we are invited to reflect not just on the cold, hard facts of the criminal case, but on the enduring, human reality of the survivors. Their stories are a testament to the absolute, unwavering power of the human spirit to endure, to survive, and to find the courage to hold the powerful accountable, even when the path to justice seems insurmountable. The women who walked out of the Daiwasa gates were not just victims. They were survivors who had, through their own individual and collective actions, forced the world to finally acknowledge the reality of their suffering and to deliver a measure of justice. They turned their pain into the catalyst for a systemic, institutional reckoning. Their bravery in testifying, in detailing the horrors they had experienced, and in refusing to be silenced by the fear that had been so carefully, systematically cultivated by their captors, was an extraordinary act of resistance. It is in their resilience, their strength, and their eventual ability to navigate the complex, often daunting process of reclaiming their lives that the true legacy of the case is found. They continue to walk the long, difficult path of healing, and their presence serves as an enduring, powerful reminder that the protection of human dignity must be the central, non-negotiable, and foundational principle of all economic activity. The Daiwasa tragedy also demands that we, as a global society, remain vigilant. The mechanisms of human trafficking are constantly evolving, becoming more sophisticated, more adept at exploiting the gaps in our legal, social, and economic systems. We must remain constantly, actively engaged in the process of identifying, challenging, and dismantling these structures wherever they emerge. The case was a wake-up call, a decisive, powerful illustration of what happens when we, as a society, allow the pursuit of profit to outpace the protection of human rights. It reminds us that our responsibilities extend beyond our immediate, physical surroundings and that the global nature of our economy necessitates a corresponding, global commitment to the values of justice, equality, and the inherent, non-negotiable value of every human life. The survivors of Daiwasa have reminded us of the absolute importance of the rule of law, the necessity of proactive advocacy, and the power of human connection in the fight against the forces of exploitation. Their story is a permanent, essential part of the tapestry of human rights history, a record that serves as both a warning and a guiding light for the future, ensuring that we do not forget the lessons learned at such a devastating, profound cost. Finally, the Daiwasa case stands as a powerful, enduring testament to the necessity of systemic empathy. It is not enough to simply react to the most extreme, graphic, and well-publicized cases of exploitation. We must foster a broader, deeper, and more proactive concern for the invisible, often forgotten populations who labor in the shadows of our global economy. We must be willing to look closer, to ask harder questions, and to recognize that the price of our goods, the convenience of our lifestyles, and the efficiency of our markets can, and often do, carry a hidden, devastating cost. By committing ourselves to a greater, more consistent level of ethical responsibility and oversight, we honor the courage of the survivors, we validate their struggle, and we take a meaningful, necessary step toward ensuring that the nightmare they endured does not repeat itself elsewhere. The story of Daiwasa does not end with a final gavel in the federal court. It continues in our ongoing commitment to the principles of human dignity, equality, and justice for all, serving as an ever-present, essential reminder that the fight for human rights is never truly finished, but must be fought, every day, in every corner of the world, with vigilance, with commitment, and with the unwavering conviction that every single human life is, and must always be, beyond price. The memory of the workers of Daiwasa is a call for us to be better, to do more, and to never again allow the promise of opportunity to be perverted into the machinery of enslavement. Their legacy is the enduring, firm, and persistent pursuit of a world where such a nightmare is not just dismantled after the fact, but made impossible to initiate in the first place, a vision that we must continue to pursue with the absolute, unyielding intensity that their survival and their humanity so clearly and profoundly demand of us all. The echoes of the Daiwasa tragedy do not merely fade into the archives of legal history. They continue to vibrate through the modern landscape of labor rights and human rights advocacy, serving as a permanent, cautionary monument to the fragility of human dignity in the face of unchecked industrial ambition. While the 2005 sentencing of Kil Sue Lee marked the end of the legal battle, the narrative of the workers continues to function as an essential, living component of the global struggle against forced labor. Their experience remains a benchmark, a point of reference used by international organizations, human rights researchers, and policymakers to illustrate the catastrophic outcomes when corporate oversight fails to penetrate the remote, insular corners of the global supply chain. The sheer scale of the Daiwasa case, the systematic coordination of recruitment, the deliberate erasure of identity, and the cold-blooded application of physical violence provided an unprecedented window into the operational reality of modern slavery. It forced the international community to acknowledge that trafficking is not a relic of the past, but a modern, adaptive, and highly lucrative business model that thrives on the very same globalization that promises to connect the world. The legacy of the women who suffered at Daiwasa is now woven into the very fabric of how we identify, categorize, and combat these crimes today, forcing a reevaluation of the responsibilities held by transnational corporations and the governments that regulate them. The ripple effects of the Daiwasa verdict extended far beyond the immediate sphere of federal law enforcement. They fundamentally shifted the expectations placed upon companies operating globally. The exposure of the Daiwasa compound made it impossible for major brands and international retailers to simply plead ignorance when their supply chains were compromised by forced labor. It established a new, more stringent standard of due diligence, wherein the onus of accountability moved from a passive, administrative oversight to an active, proactive duty of care. Companies could no longer hide behind the defense that their subcontractors were independent entities operating beyond their immediate control. The Daiwasa case demonstrated that the moral and, eventually, legal liability for human rights abuses within a supply chain is a fundamental responsibility that cannot be outsourced or ignored. This shift toward mandatory, transparent supply chain reporting, which has gained significant traction in the decades since the closure of the factory, finds its roots in the harrowing, brutal lessons learned on that island. The survivors of the factory are the silent partners in every piece of legislation, every corporate social responsibility framework, and every human rights audit that seeks to prevent such a tragedy from recurring. Their suffering created a new, non-negotiable expectation of transparency that serves as a vital safeguard against the repetition of such industrial-scale abuse. Furthermore, the Daiwasa case significantly impacted the development of victim-centered approaches within the judicial system. The realization that the survivors were not merely witnesses, but individuals who required long-term, comprehensive support transformed the way law enforcement agencies and social services interact with victims of human trafficking. The transition of the women from captives of the factory to protected witnesses of the state highlighted the absolute necessity of integrated, trauma-informed care. It revealed that justice is not served when the process of securing a conviction further degrades or re-traumatizes those who have already suffered beyond measure. The subsequent development of better, more humane, and more effective witness protection programs and the widespread adoption of specialized services for human trafficking victims owes a debt to the advocacy that emerged in the wake of the Tafuna disaster. The recognition that a victim's ability to participate in the legal process is directly tied to their immediate physical and psychological well-being is now a cornerstone of federal human trafficking strategy, a concept that was clearly, painfully proven by the experience of the Daiwasa workers. The legal system's improved ability to foster trust, provide security, and maintain the safety of victims is a direct, tangible outcome of the hard-won insights gained throughout the prosecution of the case. The sociological impact of the Daiwasa tragedy also touched upon the way we interpret the concept of migration and the vulnerabilities inherent in the global labor market. The women who were targeted were not victims of bad luck. They were victims of a deliberate, sophisticated strategy that exploited their socioeconomic marginalization. Their story serves as a profound, cautionary tale about the dangers of unregulated, transnational labor migration. It exposed the reality that for the most vulnerable populations, the pursuit of a better life often leads through a gauntlet of recruiters, middlemen, and predatory employers who thrive in the gap between the regulations of the sending and receiving countries. By bringing this reality into the center of the public consciousness, the case of the Daiwasa workers has contributed to a more robust, informed, and critical discussion about the systemic inequalities that drive human trafficking. It has fostered a greater global awareness of the power dynamics that allow such abuse to exist, urging policymakers to look past the individual criminals and address the structural, socioeconomic conditions that make the victim's entrapment possible in the first place. This broader, more nuanced understanding of the intersection between migration, poverty, and labor exploitation is a crucial, lasting outcome of the public and judicial reckoning with the horrors of the Daiwasa factory. In the years that followed the closure of the factory, the survivors themselves have become the living, breathing witnesses to the resilience of the human spirit. Their ability to transition from the extreme, dehumanizing environment of the Tafuna compound to building lives for themselves in the United States is a narrative of profound, personal triumph. Their journey, while always shadowed by the trauma of their experiences, is one that demonstrates the capacity for healing and the inherent human drive for self-determination. They have navigated the complexities of immigration, the challenges of integration, and the ongoing, difficult task of reclaiming their own stories from the narrative of victimization. By choosing to speak out, by choosing to remain present, and by choosing to seek a future that is entirely their own, they have denied their captors the ultimate goal of their violence, the total erasure of their individual and collective humanity. Their stories continue to empower others who are currently trapped in similar conditions, providing a beacon of hope and a practical, proven roadmap for the possibility of liberation and legal redress. They have transformed their experience of extreme, structural oppression into a powerful, enduring platform for advocacy, continuing to shine a light into the darkest, most hidden corners of the global economy. The institutional memory of the Daiwasa tragedy also serves as a vital, constant, and proactive check on the complacency that can often emerge within regulatory bodies. The case reminds us that the effectiveness of our laws is entirely dependent on the willingness of enforcement agencies to engage, to challenge, and to act when they encounter evidence of abuse. It serves as a permanent, institutional reminder that regulatory blind spots, no matter how small, can rapidly evolve into sites of systemic, industrial-scale cruelty if they are not consistently and actively scrutinized. The Daiwasa factory is a perpetual reference point in the training of new federal agents, in the development of labor monitoring protocols, and in the ongoing, rigorous, and necessary process of ensuring that our oversight systems remain as adaptive and dynamic as the criminals they are intended to combat. It is a cautionary, institutional memory that ensures the lessons of 2000 are not forgotten, but are instead applied as a foundational, protective layer of the modern justice system. This constant, institutional vigilance is the most effective safeguard we possess, a shield against the complacency that has, in the past, allowed such nightmares to flourish. Ultimately, the narrative of the Daiwasa factory remains an open, vital, and deeply compelling story that continues to challenge our society to be better. It is a story that refuses to be relegated to the past. Instead, it demands our continued attention, our constant critical analysis, and our unwavering, proactive commitment to the values of justice and human dignity. It is a story that reminds us that the price of our consumer goods can never be balanced against the suffering of those who produce them. It is a story that confirms that the inherent, non-negotiable dignity of every human being must remain the primary, governing principle of our global economic and social systems. As we continue to look forward, we must carry the memory of the women who suffered at Daiwasa with us, letting their courage, their resilience, and their hard-won justice serve as the standard by which we measure our progress in the ongoing, universal, and non-negotiable fight for human rights. Their endurance, their victory, and their continued existence are the ultimate, powerful proof that the forces of exploitation, no matter how powerful, how entrenched, or how sophisticated they may appear, can be identified, confronted, and ultimately dismantled by the strength of the law and the courage of those who refuse to remain silent. The story of Daiwasa is not just a tragedy, it is an enduring, essential, and powerful catalyst for the ongoing, necessary, and vital process of creating a world where no one can ever again be treated as property, where the promise of the American dream can never again be weaponized as a trap, and where the fundamental, inherent dignity of every human person is, and always will be, recognized, protected, and honored without exception or qualification. Their legacy is the relentless, persistent, and successful pursuit of a global community that is built not on the hidden, dark, and brutal exploitation of the vulnerable, but on the transparent, equal, and shared respect for the inherent, non-negotiable humanity of all people, everywhere for all time. The final chapter of the Daiwasa story is not found within the sterile confines of a federal courtroom, nor is it contained within the cold text of a sentencing memorandum. It is found in the quiet, persistent, and often invisible recovery of the individuals who were once defined by their captivity, but who have now reclaimed the definition of their own lives. When we consider the aftermath of such a profound violation of human rights, we must focus our attention on the long-term arc of survival. The legal victory was a necessary mechanism for shutting down the factory, but the true triumph lies in the survivor's ability to navigate the complex, often daunting process of healing after the nightmare had been dismantled. For many of the women, this process required an extraordinary level of courage, as they had to move beyond the immediate trauma of their abuse and address the deep, structural changes that had been imposed upon their lives. They had to learn to operate in a society that was entirely foreign to them, navigating the challenges of a new language, a different legal landscape, and the ongoing, difficult task of rebuilding their personal and professional identities from the foundation of a shattered past. The story of their recovery is a testament to the fact that while the systems of exploitation can temporarily strip a human being of their agency, they can never fully extinguish the innate, resilient force of the human spirit that seeks its own restoration. The enduring impact of the Daiwasa tragedy on the legal and social consciousness of the United States cannot be overstated. It served as a landmark case that fundamentally transformed the government's approach to human trafficking, compelling a shift from a reactive to a proactive model of intervention. The federal resources, the specialized training for law enforcement, and the increased institutional emphasis on identifying trafficking in remote or overlooked jurisdictions are all, in many ways, direct responses to the lessons learned on the island. The tragedy provided a clear, graphic, and undeniable demonstration of how vulnerability is systematically exploited by predatory networks, and it established a blueprint for how the justice system could, and must, respond to such threats. This institutional legacy ensures that the suffering of the Daiwasa workers was not in vain, as their experience continues to inform the mechanisms of protection that are now in place for thousands of individuals who are at risk of similar exploitation. Every time an investigator identifies a suspicious labor operation, every time a victim of trafficking is granted the protection of the state, and every time a corporation is held accountable for the practices of its subcontractors, the legacy of the Daiwasa survivors is being actively and honorably sustained. In reflecting on the broader implications of the Daiwasa tragedy, we must also acknowledge the critical role of community and global awareness. The case demonstrated that even the most well-hidden abuses cannot remain obscured forever, provided there is a persistent, compassionate, and observant community that refuses to turn a blind eye to the reality of suffering. The role of the local church organizations, the activists who persisted despite the odds, and the journalists who brought the story into the public eye serves as a vital, necessary reminder of the power of civic vigilance. Their willingness to act, to document, and to demand accountability was the first, essential step in a process that eventually reached the highest levels of the American federal government. It is a story that emphasizes the importance of shared responsibility, illustrating that the protection of human rights is not solely the duty of law enforcement or state authorities, but a collaborative, community-based imperative that requires the active, engaged, and informed participation of every citizen who values the principles of liberty and justice. The Daiwasa factory may have been an isolated, fortified compound, but it was not beyond the reach of the conscience of the people, and the case stands as a powerful, enduring reminder of the transformative power of collective action. Furthermore, we must continue to confront the uncomfortable, underlying realities that the Daiwasa case exposed regarding the global supply chain. The desire for inexpensive goods, the relentless pressure for efficiency, and the systemic tendency to prioritize market competitiveness over human rights are issues that remain deeply embedded in our global economic structure. The tragedy of Daiwasa serves as an essential, ongoing check on our collective complacency, forcing us to ask difficult, uncomfortable questions about the true cost of the products we consume and the systems that bring them to our shelves. It is a story that reminds us that the human beings behind our goods are not mere inputs into an industrial process, but individuals with rights, dignity, and a profound, fundamental claim to justice. By maintaining a clear, persistent, and unwavering focus on the human cost of our global economy, we contribute to the vital, ongoing process of ensuring that the values of human rights are not just idealistic concepts, but the foundational, non-negotiable principles upon which all our economic interactions are built. The Daewasa case provides the essential, moral, and historical grounding for this work, ensuring that we never lose sight of the people who pay the real, human price for our global systems of trade. As we look toward the future, the story of the Daewasa survivors remains a source of profound, enduring, and essential hope. It is a story that confirms that the forces of exploitation, no matter how entrenched or how brutally enforced, are not invincible. When the truth is exposed, when the law is applied with precision and commitment, and when the victims are provided with the support and the agency they deserve, the structures of injustice can, and will, be dismantled. The survivor's victory is a victory for the principle that human life is the ultimate, non-negotiable value, a principle that we must continue to champion in every corner of the world. Their triumph, though achieved through a journey of unimaginable agony, stands as an inspiration for the continuing, global struggle for human rights, a struggle that requires our constant, proactive, and unwavering commitment. We must remain vigilant, we must remain engaged, and we must remain absolutely, unyieldingly committed to the belief that such a tragedy can and must be prevented. The legacy of the survivors is a clear, persistent call for us to build a future where every human being is afforded the dignity, the respect, and the protections that are their birthright, ensuring that the nightmare of Daewasa remains a part of history that is never, under any circumstances, repeated. Finally, we are left with the profound, resonant reality of the survivors' lives today. They have transitioned from being the victims of a modern-day slave operation to being the architects of their own, independent, and hard-won futures. Their resilience is not just a personal achievement, it is a profound, societal gift. By rebuilding their lives, by finding their voices, and by persisting in the face of such profound, institutionalized cruelty, they have redefined the narrative of the Daewasa tragedy from one of absolute despair to one of persistent, human defiance. Their existence is the ultimate, powerful proof that the spirit of the human person is capable of surviving even the darkest, most oppressive systems, and that the promise of justice, while often delayed, is an essential, fundamental force in our society. The story of Daewasa is a story that will continue to challenge, to inform, and to inspire us, serving as a reminder that the protection of human dignity is the most essential, vital task we share. Their lives, their stories, and their resilience remain the central, defining, and most important aspects of the Daewasa legacy, a legacy that will continue to shine, to teach, and to demand our absolute, sustained, and unwavering commitment to the values of justice, equality, and the inherent, non-negotiable humanity of all people, everywhere for all time. In their story, we find the imperative to never be silent, to never be indifferent, and to never allow the machinery of exploitation to operate in the shadows, ensuring that the light of justice remains a constant, guiding force in our pursuit of a world that is worthy of the resilience and the courage of the women of Tafuna. Their endurance is our collective, permanent reminder that we are all, ultimately, responsible for the protection and the honor of one another, and that the fight for freedom is a shared, essential, and non-negotiable commitment that we must uphold, with integrity and with absolute, unwavering resolve, in the face of every challenge that seeks to diminish the value of a human life. The legacy of the survivors is thus the most enduring, most profound, and most essential part of the Daewasa story, a legacy of triumph over terror, of humanity over greed, and of justice over the darkness of slavery, forever marking the history of our time as a testament to the unquenchable, powerful, and essential nature of the human right to be free. The final, reflective consideration of the Daewasa tragedy necessitates a broader look at the concept of accountability in the context of human rights, particularly when the perpetrators operate within the protective cloak of corporate structures. The case of Kill Sue Lee and the garment facility in Tafuna serves as a brutal masterclass in the ways that global economic entities can, if left unchecked, subvert the very laws designed to protect their employees. When we scrutinize the mechanics of this exploitation, we see a deliberate effort to create an environment where the legal obligations of the employer were completely severed from the physical reality of the workers. This separation was the engine of the entire system. By operating in a territory that was nominally American yet functionally isolated from federal oversight, Lee essentially built a sandbox for cruelty where the standard, established mechanisms of labor law were rendered impotent. The lessons learned from this structural failure are now embedded in the standard operating procedures of international human rights organizations, who use the Daiwusa case as a definitive example of why corporate accountability must be strictly enforced, regardless of the jurisdictional convenience favored by the perpetrators of exploitation. We have learned that the formal legal status of a region cannot be a shield against the fundamental, moral requirements of human rights, and the Daiwusa case stands as a permanent, ironclad warning against the dangers of jurisdictional arbitrage in the pursuit of labor. Moreover, the psychological resilience demonstrated by the women after the dismantling of the factory offers a profound, deeply moving insight into the capacity for human recovery. It is vital to recognize that the healing process was not a linear trajectory but a slow, often painful unfolding that occurred over many years. In the wake of their liberation, the survivors had to contend not only with the physical damage of their incarceration but also with the persistent, internalized trauma of their confinement. The transition to freedom required them to dismantle the mental barriers of terror that had been carefully constructed by their captors. This involved reclaiming their own stories, asserting their rights as individuals rather than objects, and, in many cases, re-engaging with the world as active, self-determined participants in their own future. The support structures that emerged to assist them, ranging from trauma-informed counseling services to legal aid and community advocacy, demonstrated that the restoration of dignity is a communal effort. The survivors' ability to find their voices, to articulate the reality of their suffering, and to eventually integrate into new societies as empowered, contributing members is the true, ultimate defeat of the system Kill Sue Lee sought to build. His intention was to break them, to render them permanently compliant, yet their persistence in living full, autonomous lives is a testament to the fact that his project of total human degradation ultimately, and definitively, failed. The structural impact on federal labor law and immigration policy also bears the distinct, indelible imprint of the Daiwusa disaster. The introduction and evolution of the T-visa program were not mere bureaucratic adjustments. They were profound, legislative responses to the specific needs of victims who had been trapped in situations of involuntary servitude. This legal framework acknowledged that the victims of trafficking often required more than just immediate, temporary assistance. They needed a pathway to stability, protection from further victimization, and the institutional recognition that they were not to be held responsible for the illegal conditions they had been coerced into maintaining. The legacy of the women who spoke up against the guards and the management of Daiwusa is thus found in the thousands of trafficking victims who have since utilized these protective legal pathways to secure their own safety and independence. This policy evolution is the direct, systemic manifestation of the lessons learned during the federal intervention in American Samoa, ensuring that the legal system is better equipped to recognize, support, and protect those who are subjected to the most severe forms of human exploitation. The Daiwusa case remains a foundational reference point for the ongoing, necessary refinement of these tools, ensuring that the law serves as a reliable, protective, and empowering force for the vulnerable, rather than a system they must navigate with fear and uncertainty. As we consider the persistent threat of modern-day slavery, it is also essential to acknowledge the role of technology and transparency in the modern era. In the year since the Daiwusa operation was shut down, the evolution of digital communication, the increased public awareness of supply chain ethics, and the proliferation of real-time, global tracking systems have created new, powerful tools for the prevention of trafficking. However, the tragedy of the Tafuna compound serves as a stark, ever-present reminder that technology can also be used to facilitate control, surveillance, and isolation if it is not governed by a clear, uncompromising commitment to ethical practices. We are faced with a paradoxical reality. While we have more ways than ever to monitor our global systems, the entities that thrive on exploitation are also becoming more sophisticated, more adept at hiding behind layers of subcontracting, and more capable of exploiting the gaps in our digital and physical infrastructure. The Daewoo case remains an essential, grounding narrative in this ongoing, high-stakes contest, reminding us that no amount of technological transparency can replace the necessity of human vigilance, the requirement for ethical, principled leadership, and the fundamental, non-negotiable demand for transparency at every single level of the production process. The survivors of the factory are, in effect, the moral compass of this ongoing struggle, their experience providing the critical, clear-eyed perspective required to ensure that our tools of progress do not, inadvertently, become the instruments of new, equally sophisticated forms of human bondage. The narrative of the Daewoo factory also compels us to address the systemic, economic, and social disparities that allow human trafficking to persist on a global scale. It is a tragedy that flourishes in the fertile ground of poverty, desperation, and lack of opportunity. The women who were targeted by the recruiters were not anomalies. They were representative of a vast, global population that is routinely, systematically ignored by the mainstream structures of economic opportunity. The Daewoo case forces us to recognize that the fight against human trafficking cannot be decoupled from the broader, persistent fight against global inequality. It is not enough to focus solely on the enforcement of law at the point of labor. We must also work to address the underlying, systemic, and socioeconomic factors that make the promise of false opportunities so dangerously and fatally attractive to the most vulnerable individuals in our global community. By investing in education, by promoting genuine, sustainable economic development, and by fostering social systems that provide true, safe, and dignified avenues for individual empowerment, we are actively and fundamentally undermining the very conditions that allow traffickers to operate. The legacy of the survivors is thus the advocacy for a more just, equitable, and sustainable world, one where the inherent value of a human being is never, under any circumstances, subordinated to the profit-driven demands of the global market. In the final assessment, the story of the Daewoo garment factory is a story about the absolute, non-negotiable, and inherent dignity of the human person. It is a story that confirms that no matter the location, no matter the legal system, and no matter the scale of the exploitation, the violation of human rights will always leave an indelible mark on the collective consciousness of our society. The courage of the women of Tafuna is a beacon that continues to shine, a permanent, essential, and powerful reminder that the forces of darkness and greed can be defeated by the combined, persistent, and unwavering force of truth and justice. As we continue to move forward, we carry the memory of their suffering, their resilience, and their ultimate triumph, ensuring that the lessons of the past are translated into the proactive, informed, and determined actions of the present. The legacy of the women is the enduring, firm, and persistent commitment to a world where human rights are not just a legal abstraction, but the actual, lived, and protected reality for every single person. Their story is the defining, essential narrative of our ongoing struggle for justice, a narrative that we must carry with us, learn from, and honor, ensuring that the nightmare of Daewoo is not just a part of history, but a catalyst for the permanent and fundamental improvement of our collective human future, a future where every single individual is recognized, empowered, and protected as the essential, precious, and non-negotiable human being they are, and will always be, everywhere for all time. The final word of this story is not one of tragedy, but one of profound, lasting, and transformative human strength, a strength that has, against all odds, carved a pathway toward justice that will remain open, protected, and honored long after the factory has been erased from the map, ensuring that the light of their humanity forever remains the guiding, unwavering, and essential standard of our commitment to one another in the pursuit of a global community that is finally and truly free. As we arrive at the final, concluding reflection of this harrowing journey into the heart of the Daewoo tragedy, it is imperative to pause and fully grasp the magnitude of what has been uncovered, analyzed, and memorialized. The story of the Tafuna Garment Factory is not a distant, localized incident isolated in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It is a profound, universal manifestation of the struggle between the dehumanizing greed of industrialized exploitation and the unbreakable, resilient spirit of the human person. Over the course of this exploration, we have traced the entire arc of this catastrophe, from the meticulously crafted deception of the recruitment process to the absolute, crushing reality of the forced labor conditions, through the long, agonizing night of systemic violence, and into the eventual, hard-won light of federal justice. Each phase of this history serves as an essential, foundational block in our understanding of what modern slavery actually looks like, how it functions in the gaps of our legal systems, and most importantly, how it can be confronted and systematically dismantled by a dedicated, principled, and unwavering commitment to the rule of law. We must recognize that the survivors of Daiwasa did not just survive a factory. They survived a sophisticated, multi-layered apparatus of control designed to strip them of their very existence as individual, autonomous beings. The fact that they overcame this apparatus is not just a personal victory. It is a powerful, enduring, and essential confirmation that justice is a force that, when applied with integrity and persistence, is capable of prevailing against even the most entrenched and brutal systems of oppression. The legacy of these women is now permanently inscribed in the history of human rights, serving as a vital reference point for all future efforts to identify, challenge, and eradicate the persistence of human trafficking. We have seen how the legal proceedings brought in the wake of the factory's closure provided not only a definitive reckoning for Kil Su Lee and his accomplices, but also a transformative shift in the way our society defines and prosecutes the crime of involuntary servitude. The 40-year prison sentence imposed upon the mastermind of this scheme was more than a mere punishment. It was a strong, unequivocal, and necessary assertion that the fundamental rights of the individual, the right to freedom, the right to bodily integrity, and the right to fair and just compensation for labor, are not negotiable or conditional based on geographic location or economic convenience. By bringing the reality of the Daiwasa factory into the clear, analytical light of the federal court, the justice system effectively codified the understanding that trafficking is an industrial-scale offense against the very foundation of our social contract. This precedent continues to serve as an active, potent deterrent, ensuring that those who might seek to profit from the enslavement of others in the shadows of the global economy are aware that the reach of the law is long, the commitment of the authorities is deep, and the consequences of their actions will be absolute, severe, and final. Furthermore, we must acknowledge the profoundly transformative impact of the survivors' courage on the collective conscience of our modern global community. Their willingness to come forward, to detail the intimate and graphic realities of their suffering, and to face their abusers in the formal, structured environment of a federal trial was an act of bravery that reverberates far beyond the courtroom. They challenged the systemic silence that surrounds modern slavery, refusing to let their experience be buried by the shame or the fear that their captors had so carefully cultivated. Their persistence in pursuing justice, their resilience in navigating the slow, often grueling process of rehabilitation, and their ultimate ability to reclaim their lives as empowered individuals have provided a roadmap for victims of trafficking around the world. They have shown that while the trauma of forced labor is a life-altering event, it does not define the limits of human possibility. They have reclaimed their agency, transformed their personal agony into a powerful platform for institutional change, and ensured that their story, the story of their struggle and their ultimate victory, will remain a vital, active part of the global movement for the protection of human rights. Their endurance is a source of profound inspiration, serving as a reminder that the fight for freedom is a continuous, essential, and non-negotiable duty that we all share, a fight that is fueled by the courage of those who refuse to be silenced, forgotten, or treated as property. In moving toward the future, we carry the memory of the Daiwasa factory as a foundational, protective layer of our institutional vigilance. We have been reminded, through the stark and undeniable evidence of the Tafuna compound, that the systems of exploitation are not static. They are highly adaptive, constantly seeking new gaps in our regulatory, economic, and digital infrastructure to exploit. Therefore, our commitment to prevention must be equally dynamic, proactive, and comprehensive. The lessons we have learned, the absolute necessity of supply chain transparency, the requirement for robust and consistent labor monitoring, the importance of trauma-informed victim support, and the fundamental, non-negotiable value of the individual, must be integrated into every aspect of our global policy, our corporate governance, and our individual consumption choices. We must remain vigilant, constantly asking ourselves if the convenience we enjoy is being subsidized by the hidden, brutal labor of those who are trapped in the shadows. We must ensure that our global systems of trade are fundamentally anchored in the principles of justice, equity, and respect, rather than being allowed to drift toward the cold, market-driven logic that enabled the horror of Daiwusa to flourish in the first place. The story of the women of Tafuna is our moral, ethical, and practical guide for this ongoing mission, a guide that demands our total, sustained, and unwavering engagement. Ultimately, the tragedy of Daiwusa and the resilience of its survivors lead us to a final, profound, and essential truth. The protection of human dignity is the most significant, demanding, and rewarding task that we can undertake as a society. It is the core, defining value upon which all other institutions of liberty, justice, and equality must rest. The Daiwusa case, in all its darkness and all its eventual, hard-won light, reminds us that the violation of one person's humanity is a challenge to the humanity of us all. It reminds us that we are all, in a fundamental, meaningful sense, responsible for the safety, the dignity, and the freedom of one another across every border, every language, and every economic divide. This shared responsibility is not a burden to be avoided or a duty to be outsourced. It is the essential, vital, and transformative foundation of the global community we strive to build. We honor the women of Daiwusa, not just by remembering their pain, but by committing ourselves to a future where the possibility of such pain is systematically, proactively, and definitively eradicated from the human experience. We do this by staying informed, by staying critical, by staying involved, and by maintaining a firm, uncompromising belief that the inherent, non-negotiable value of a human life is the standard by which our progress must be measured, today, tomorrow, and forever. As we close this chapter, we recognize that the story of the Daiwusa factory will always stand as a sentinel in the history of our time, watching over the global conscience and reminding us of both the potential for devastating human cruelty and the incredible, persistent power of the human capacity to survive, to heal, and to demand justice against all odds. Their survival, their victory, and their continued endurance are the ultimate, powerful evidence that the forces of exploitation, though they may operate in the dark, can never withstand the persistent, united force of truth, transparency, and the rule of law. We are forever changed by their experience, forever indebted to their courage, and forever committed to the ongoing, essential work of ensuring that their nightmare, their trauma, and their struggle are the final, definitive records of such a system. The legacy of the women of Daiwusa is the enduring, firm, and persistent pursuit of a world where every single human being is recognized, empowered, and protected as the essential, precious, and non-negotiable human being they are, and will always be, everywhere for all time. Their story is now our shared, collective, and ongoing responsibility, a responsibility that we must uphold with integrity, with empathy, and with the unwavering conviction that the light of their humanity, that singular, powerful, and essential spark, will always remain the guiding, unwavering, and vital standard for our commitment to one another in the ongoing, universal, and non-negotiable fight for the freedom, the dignity, and the inherent, non-negotiable rights of all people. This is the promise we make in their name, the promise we carry in our hearts, and the promise we will continue to honor, with every action and every decision, in the pursuit of a world that is finally and truly worthy of the resilience and the courage of the women of Tafuna, ensuring their light never fades, but continues to illuminate the path toward a future that is defined not by the exploitation of the past, but by the shared, transparent, and equal humanity of the future. As we push beyond the immediate legal aftermath and the personal recoveries of the survivors, we are compelled to examine the broader, unseen architecture of complicity that allows a tragedy like the Daewoo factory to exist in the first place, because Kil-Soo Lee, despite his undeniable status as the primary architect of this suffering, did not operate in a vacuum. The creation, maintenance, and prolonged concealment of a forced labor camp on a United States territory required a complex, interconnected web of silent enablers, ranging from local bureaucrats and shipping logistics companies to the international network of labor recruiters and, ultimately, the distant consumers who unwittingly purchased the fruits of this enslaved workforce. To truly understand the mechanics of modern human trafficking, we must move our analytical lens away from the singular figure of the mastermind and focus it on the terrifying normalization of exploitation that permeates the global supply chain, a normalization that relies heavily on the deliberate turning of blind eyes and the systemic prioritization of economic efficiency over fundamental human rights. The Tafuna compound was not simply a rogue operation. It was a symptom of a much larger, structural disease within the globalized economy, an environment where the relentless demand for cheap, rapid production creates dark, unregulated voids where human life is easily and efficiently reduced to a disposable commodity. When we consider the logistical reality of moving hundreds of young women across the Pacific Ocean, securing their visas under fraudulent pretenses, importing massive quantities of raw materials, and exporting finished garments bearing the prestigious Made in USA label, it becomes chillingly apparent that this operation required the passive, if not active, cooperation of countless individuals and institutions. The recruitment agencies in Vietnam and China, acting as the initial predatory point of contact, were entirely complicit in the deception, knowingly sending desperate individuals into a situation where their vulnerability would be weaponized against them. They were the first link in a chain of exploitation, profiting immensely from the ruinous recruitment fees that effectively bound the workers to their future captivity. Furthermore, the local infrastructure in American Samoa, the shipping ports, the utility providers, the local administrative bodies, all interacted with Daewoo as a legitimate business entity, failing to question the highly militarized, secretive nature of a facility that was surrounded by barbed wire and patrolled by armed guards. This collective failure of curiosity, this systemic refusal to ask the difficult questions about how a factory could produce such massive volumes of goods without any visible, fairly compensated workforce, is the very oxygen that allows human trafficking to breathe and expand. It is a stark, terrifying reminder that evil does not always announce itself with dramatic overtures. Rather, it often disguises itself within the mundane, bureaucratic processes of international trade, hiding in plain sight behind customs declarations, shipping manifests, and corporate tax filings. The Daewoo case forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that our global economic systems are inherently vulnerable to this type of parasitic exploitation, precisely because they are designed to facilitate the frictionless movement of capital and goods while often neglecting the rigorous, proactive monitoring required to ensure the safety and dignity of the human labor that makes that movement possible. This systemic apathy is not merely a passive failure. It is an active, structural enabler that provides the essential camouflage for predators like Kil-Soo Lee to construct their empires of suffering. Moreover, the profound legacy of the Daewoo tragedy is intrinsically tied to the crucial, historical evolution of international human rights legislation, particularly the United States approach to combating modern slavery through the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. The horrific revelations that emerged from the Tafuna compound arrived at a critical, defining moment in legislative history, serving as a powerful, undeniable catalyst for lawmakers who were struggling to define and penalize the complex, transnational nature of human trafficking. Before cases like Daewoo shattered the public illusion of safety, the legal frameworks available to prosecute such crimes were often fragmented, inadequate, and ill-equipped to address the psychological coercion and the sophisticated, debt-based bondage that defined modern forced labor. The vivid, irrefutable evidence of the physical violence, the systematic starvation, and the complete confiscation of the workers' identities provided a harrowing, textbook example of why new, comprehensive, and aggressive legislative tools were absolute necessities. The case demonstrated, with devastating clarity, that traditional labor laws and standard immigration regulations were entirely insufficient to protect vulnerable populations from predators who understood how to manipulate the gray areas of international jurisdiction. As a direct result, the narrative of the Daewoo survivors became inextricably linked to the push for robust, systemic reform, providing the moral urgency and the undeniable factual basis required to establish trafficking not just as a labor violation, but as a severe, federal crime carrying unprecedented, heavy penalties. The resulting legislation fundamentally shifted the paradigm, formally recognizing the victims not as undocumented immigrants or complicit laborers, but as survivors of a severe human rights abuse who required immediate state protection, comprehensive social services, and specialized legal pathways such as the T-visa. This monumental shift in legal philosophy, moving from a system that often penalized the victims to one that actively seeks to protect and empower them, is perhaps the most enduring, institutional legacy of the Daewoo tragedy, ensuring that the suffering endured in the Pacific was translated into a permanent, structural shield that now protects countless other vulnerable individuals across the globe. Yet, as we reflect on these legislative victories and the institutional reforms that followed the closure of the factory, we must also grapple with the complex, enduring psychology of the perpetrators and the individuals who willingly executed the daily, brutal enforcement of the captivity. It is deeply unsettling to examine how ordinary individuals, the local guards, the floor managers, the administrative staff, were co-opted into a system of profound cruelty, transitioning from mere employees into the active, violent instruments of Kill Sue Lee's tyranny. The Daewoo case provides a chilling, real-world study of how easily human empathy can be systematically dismantled and replaced by a rigid, authoritarian adherence to a deeply immoral hierarchy. The guards who wielded the iron pipes on that horrific November night were not necessarily born monsters. They were individuals who had been successfully conditioned by the environment of the factory to view the Vietnamese and Chinese women not as fellow human beings, but as property, as insubordinate machinery that required violent recalibration. This psychological conditioning, this deliberate, calculated dehumanization of the workforce, is a essential tactic of every trafficking operation, utilized to ensure that the enforcers feel absolutely no moral hesitation when commanded to inflict pain. It forces us to ask terrifying, uncomfortable questions about the fragility of our own moral compasses when placed within environments that actively reward cruelty and punish compassion. The ability of the factory management to establish a microculture where extreme violence was normalized, where starvation was considered a legitimate cost-saving measure, and where the permanent maiming of a worker was viewed merely as a necessary disciplinary action, reveals the dark, terrifying potential for localized tyranny to flourish even within the broader context of a democratic society. It serves as a permanent, cautionary warning that the institutions of justice and the frameworks of human rights must constantly, actively engage in the moral education and the rigorous, proactive monitoring of all labor environments, ensuring that the localized cultures of corporate spaces are never allowed to deviate from the fundamental, non-negotiable standards of human decency. Finally, we must recognize the profound, essential role of narrative and memory in the ongoing, universal struggle against the forces of exploitation, because the act of telling the story of Daewoo is, in itself, a powerful form of continued resistance against the perpetrator's ultimate goal of silent, unrecorded erasure. When we dissect the mechanics of this crime, when we speak the names of the survivors, and when we refuse to let the history of the Tafuna compound fade into the obscurity of forgotten legal archives, we are actively participating in the defense of human dignity. True crime storytelling, when executed with a deep, uncompromising commitment to empathy and historical accuracy, ceases to be mere entertainment and transforms into a vital, moral imperative. It becomes a mechanism for bearing witness, a tool for educating the global conscience, and a persistent, undeniable demand for continued vigilance in a world that is always at risk of repeating its darkest mistakes. The story of Daewoo demands to be heard not because it is sensational, but because it is true, because it happened, and because the structural vulnerabilities that allowed it to happen still exist in the intricate, shadowy corners of our global economy. By keeping the memory of the survivors' courage alive, We ensure that their suffering continues to function as a powerful, permanent deterrent, a beacon of warning that illuminates the treacherous waters of globalized labor. We honor their resilience by remaining fiercely, unyieldingly attentive to the signs of exploitation in our own communities, by demanding absolute transparency from the corporations that supply our goods, and by refusing to accept the convenient, comfortable illusions that mask the true human cost of our modern existence. The legacy of the Daiwasa factory is not a closed chapter. It is an open, ongoing challenge to every single one of us to remain active, compassionate, and uncompromising defenders of the inherent, non-negotiable right to freedom. It is a call to recognize that the fight against slavery is not a historical artifact, but a present, urgent, and continuous battle that requires our collective, unwavering dedication. The voices of the women who survived the nightmare of American Samoa continue to echo through time, urging us to look closer, to care deeper, and to never, under any circumstances, surrender the fundamental, universal belief that every human life is precious, every human life is deserving of respect, and every human life is absolutely, unconditionally, and forever meant to be free. In the quiet aftermath of all the testimonies, the legal verdicts, and the geopolitical shifts, there remains the indelible truth of the human spirit's capacity to endure the unendurable and emerge with its core sanctity intact, a truth that the Daiwasa case exemplifies with breathtaking clarity. As we close our examination of this unprecedented chapter in modern judicial and human rights history, we are left not with a sense of defeat, but with a profound, sobering awareness of our collective responsibility to the invisible workers who sustain the modern world. The machinery of exploitation relies entirely on the shadows, on the assumption that no one will look closely enough to see the chains, but the relentless pursuit of justice demonstrated in this case proves that the light of accountability can pierce even the most fortified compounds. The legacy of the survivors is a living, breathing testament to the power of truth over terror, serving as a permanent foundation for a global movement that will not rest until the very concept of forced labor is eradicated from the human experience entirely, ensuring that their unimaginable sacrifices will forever remain the catalyst for a more just, equitable, and compassionate world.